If you've been painting miniatures for some time, you know that there are literally hundreds, perhaps even thousands of videos about blending to achieve those smooth, creamy gradients. And these videos are great. They serve as an amazing resource to get the result you want. And after all, getting all those sweet comments about the smooth transitions you painted just feels great. But why are we obsessed with smoothness? On one hand, the answer is quite obvious. It's far more difficult to get something to look perfectly smooth rather than to get it to look rough, patchy and weathered. However, does it necessarily mean that one looks better than the other? Of course not. Just like when it comes to food, it's all about your preference. Unless you put pineapple on a pizza. That shit is heresy. But anyway, there is another reason why you shouldn't aim to make everything perfectly smooth, and that is contrast. And this time I don't mean contrast in values. No. Because you can have high contrast between shades and highlights and still get very smooth gradient. I am talking about contrast in textures. You see, when you aim to make everything perfectly smooth, it all becomes kind of the same. Let me show you what I mean. This mini was painted by one of my favorite painters, Flamon. The result is absolutely sick and looks like a CGI, but as you can see, it's all kinda the same. You cannot really see any difference in textures between the materials. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love this paint job, and painting something to resemble it would take me a lot of time. And if you were to paint something like this, it would also take you eternity, and you would end with a result that is sort of samey-same. And when everything is super reflective, then nothing really is, because your eyes don't have anything rough or matte to compare it to. So to add some visual diversity, we have to add texture. And how do we do that? When it comes to painting minis, I like to think of everything that I'm painting as either a line or a gradient. Of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, lines and gradients. If the gradient is smooth, it's a new material. If it's rough, it's old. If it's dark, there is a shade. If it's very bright, there is a highlight. Or it is very reflective. The lines, on the other hand, can add definition to your miniature. For the most part, we use black lining or recessed shading to make our miniatures more readable. For that reason, washes are more of a tool for fast results, because if you want to separate details from each other, use black lining. And you don't need a wash for that. And then there are edge highlights, which of course make your mini more readable. So why am I saying all of this? By breaking down every painted miniature into gradients and lines, you'll realize that everything is painted the same way. But by the approach that you select for your gradients, you achieve very different finish and textures. To further describe how I paint different textures, I am using this miniature from today's sponsor, RTLW Miniatures. This awesome barbarian is part of their current Kickstarter campaign called Magnetic Heroes. The main feature of these is that you're able to change any gear that you want. So for example, if you don't like musicians, simply change this harp into a dagger. Or maybe you wanna give him a coin, because of course, money is the best weapon. If, for some reason, you find beards to be repulsive, you can fix that as well. But then, why are you watching this channel? And because you have quite literally hundreds of possible combinations, it's fantastic that these miniatures have poses with their arms open, which makes painting them a pleasant experience. There is a total of 12 different heroes, which you can customize for your D&D adventures. So if this sounds exciting to you, definitely go check out their Kickstarter. Thank you RTLW Miniatures for sponsoring this video. So anyway, as I already mentioned, everything is made from lines and from gradients. This is true for this shield as well. Zenithal Highlight revealed to me that this wooden part should be lighter and that this part will be darker. On the other side, this part will be lighter and this one will be darker. Zenithal Highlight will sort of reveal to you which parts are exposed and which are darker. And while this doesn't necessarily apply to all materials, it's a good guide to find most shades and highlights. Since I already know where to put my lighter colors, I am painting exposed parts of these planks with lighter brown. This is standard layering approach. I simply mix in a bit of lighter brown into the previous color and thin it so it's semi-transparent. That way, you don't really have to come back to smooth out the transition. Instead, you apply lighter and lighter semi-transparent layer on top of each other. It's up to you how light do you want to go and how smooth you want it to be, because you can go back and apply semi-transparent base coat color to smooth it out. In this case, I don't want it to be super smooth, because it's wood after all. However, I want my shades to be darker and more interesting. So I added darker red-brown and did the same thing for less exposed parts. Once again, this is something like a thicker glaze. And keep in mind that you should always wick off excess liquid from your brush, so you have better control over it. After I got this gradient that isn't super smooth, but neither is it super rough, I started working with lines. Since wooden planks have this specific wooden pattern, I sketched thin, vertical lines and curves with lighter color. These don't have to be exactly the same, but I would definitely use just the tip of the brush so they are thin. Another thing that I do with lines is blacklining. This further adds definition by separating planks from each other. For edge highlights, I added even lighter color, and you already see that with really dark recesses and quite light edge highlights, the wooden texture comes together. We used simple techniques, got fast result, and didn't have to focus on blending and smoothness. Okay, but I hear you asking, but you surely have to paint smoothly for non-metallic metal, right? Right? No. I specifically tried to make trim of this shield very rough and weathered, so all my layers are a bit thicker to create texture. By the way, you can see here an interesting phenomenon. That's a feature of using acrylics. Once your layer becomes dry, it also becomes darker. Just look at this part when I applied it and now when it's fully dry. What a difference, huh? For that reason, you can apply the same color multiple times, but every time covering smaller part to make a gradient. On top of that, I applied more lighter layers using stippling. So essentially, I am stabbing the miniature. Non-metallic metal is not about smoothness, but about high contrast. So that's what I am aiming for here. Of course, I added edge highlights here as well and blacklined all the details to make it more readable. Recess shading and blacklining will make every single miniature more defined, and if you have the time, I would recommend for you to do it as well. Since I wanted to create some more battled image and worn look, I added inconsistent curves around the edges. Usually when you add enough scratches and stipples, you also hide imperfections in your gradient, because then it doesn't look bad. It simply becomes more complex because you have more information there. I didn't even use any blending when it comes to this sword as well. After the base coat, I remembered the placement of highlights from zenithal priming and used it accordingly. With the same layering approach, I proceed to cover them with lighter and lighter color. There was another thing that I realized as I was painting it. The smaller stuff you paint, the less time you need to dedicate to blending. This is because unless you look really close, small imperfections won't be noticeable. However, your eyes will be 100% able to see contrast. So this is why it's important and everyone talks about it all the time. Blacklining and edge highlighting increase contrast as well, which is the underlying principle of why it makes your miniatures more defined. When we go back to adding more information or texture, you can do it pretty much anywhere. Maybe it doesn't always fit skin tones, for example, but even relatively smooth materials like fabric can be painted entirely using stippling. If I was being very blunt as I was stabbing the shield, here I am softly using tiny little dots. Aside from the base coat, entire volume of this fabric is painted by stippling it like this. I cover less and less surface with every lighter paint I add. If you progress slowly, you can get quite a nice result which looks natural. And even when I say that you should progress slowly, this took me like 6 or 7 minutes. So as I already said, pretty much anything is painted by either using lines and curves or gradients. How you achieve those gradients, how smooth you make them, how light or dark you make them will ultimately decide what does the material read as. And majority of all things on miniatures don't require ultra smooth blending to make them look good or right, especially if you paint 35mm scale or smaller. And let me tell you right now, if you don't know how to blend and get that super sweet, creamy, smooth blend, you should definitely learn how to do that. But once you do know how to do it, it's also a good idea to learn how to make stuff more interesting and achieve results faster. But once again, if you don't, there's a video for you, right here, and see you there!